My name is Herman Gens. I'm from the Department of History and Archaeology, and I will present today to you the first lecture on the Odyssey. So please take your seats. The sooner we start this, the sooner it will be over. Tell me news of the man of many ways, who was driven far journeys after he had sacked Troy's sacred citadel. Many were there, whose cities he saw, whose minds he learned of. Many the pains he suffered in his spirit on the wide sea, struggling for his own life and the homecoming of his companions. Even so he could not save his companions, hard though he strove to. They were destroyed by their own wild recklessness, fools who devoured the oxen of Helios, the sun god, and he took away the day of their homecoming. From some point here, goddess, daughter of Zeus, speak and begin our story. These sentences mark the beginning of the Odyssey, one of the greatest epics ever to be composed in ancient Greece and possibly throughout the world. In these few introductory lines, the main topics are already pointed out. The main character of the story is Odysseus. He is one of the heroes of the Trojan War. Also, his main desire is mentioned, homecoming. It furthermore becomes clear that he encountered substantial difficulties in fulfilling his desire. However, before we can embark on exploring the contents of the story and get better acquainted with its hero, Odysseus, we first have to look at some background information, such as who wrote the story, when was it composed, and what was the society like in the times of Odysseus. The story was written by the poet Homer in the late 8th century BC. Surprisingly, very little is known about Homer. He lived in the second half of the 8th century BC in the area around Smyrna, today's Izmir on the west coast of Turkey. And he wrote at least one other great epic, the Iliad, which tells a story from the Trojan War. In contrast to many legends which relate that Homer was poor and from a low social class, an analysis of the epics themselves clearly shows that he was a professional poet associated with the nobility, possibly even of noble origin himself. The high position of a poet at the court in this time is clearly illustrated by the way how the poet Demodocus is portrayed at the Phaeacian court in Book 8. Both epics, the Iliad as well as the Odyssey, relate to stories from a distant past, which according to Greek belief dated around the year 1200 BC. That is, the story of the Trojan War and its aftermath. It is hotly debated among modern scholars how far both epics, and especially the story of the Trojan War, actually reflect historical truth. But it may be speculated that at least some historical facts may be hidden in the stories. For the ancient Greeks, however, the stories reflected historical reality. So the Greeks believed that the Trojan War happened and that the heroes mentioned in the stories all really lived. Homer used stories that were well known in Greece and very likely were orally transmitted already for several centuries. The 8th century in Greece was a heroic age. The society was still dominated by kings who reigned over small regional kingdoms in various parts of Greece. Often, these kingdoms actually fought against each other. Writing had only recently been introduced to Greece from the Near East. That means from Phoenicia, the region we are in right now. Thus, it is quite astonishing to have lengthy epics of high literary quality, such as the Iliad and the Odyssey, as the first literary products of Greece. In fact, one of the earliest inscriptions in Greek from the end of the 8th century BC contains a reference to Homer's Iliad. That is what we see here on the slide, drinking cup, which actually has an inscription mentioning a drinking cup that was owned by King Nestor, one of the heroes of the Trojan War, who plays a great role in Homer's Iliad. Literacy thus started in Greece with a big bang. Epics themselves have a longer history in Greece. An epic is a heroic story mixing real, that is, historical, and fictional elements, such, for instance, the appearance of gods and monsters in the stories. Poets and bards sang these epics at the court of kings and nobles, certainly for entertainment, but more importantly, to transmit values of the society to the audience. These epics were transmitted orally for a very long time, as I've already mentioned. Thus, the contents were well known by most people. Homer, therefore, did not need to tell the whole story of the Trojan War and the homecoming of the heroes, but he could focus on the most dramatic aspects. For the sake of clarity, first the correct chronological order of the events will be summed up here. The Odyssey, as should be clear by now, takes its name from the hero Odysseus. Odysseus was the king of Ithaca, a small island on the west coast of Greece. For 10 years he fought in the Trojan War. Odysseus actually figures as one of the more important heroes in Homer's Iliad, which tells an episode of the Trojan War. It was he who constructed the wooden horse by which the Greeks finally managed to conquer Troy. The Odyssey starts after the conquest of Troy. It tells the story of Odysseus' homecoming. After Odysseus had left Troy, he planned directly to sail back to his home on Ithaca with all his men and the spoils of war he had gained when sacking Troy. However, storms and various other adventures prevented him from coming home immediately. And during these wanderings, which lasted another 10 years, he lost all his ships and his companions. The reasons for his misfortunes are mainly due to the wrath of Poseidon, the god of the sea, whose son Polyphemus, the Cyclops, Odysseus had blinded. It has to be pointed out, however, that he only blinded the Cyclops to save his own life in self-defense. We will have to come back to this point later during this lecture. Lastly, Odysseus alone arrived on the island of the nymph Calypso, who fell in love with him and wanted to marry him. She even offered him eternal life. However, Odysseus was still determined to return home, and at last built a raft on which he managed to reach the island of Scheria, where the Phaeacians lived. He received a hearty welcome there, and after having spent some time as a guest of King Alcinous, he was brought by the Phaeacians back to his own island of Ithaca. Odysseus, upon his return, had no idea what was going on in his own home. Remember, he'd been away for 20 years. On the advice of the goddess Athena, he disguised himself as a beggar to find out about the situation on Ithaca. He first stayed with Eumaeus, his old swineherd, who informed him about the general situation. Odysseus kept his disguise and only lifted it when he met his own son Telemachus. Telemachus brought Odysseus to the palace, where again he went in the disguise of a beggar. There he finds out how the suitors, young noblemen from Ithaca, abuse the concept of hospitality. They harass his wife, and Odysseus actually is being humiliated by that himself. When his wife Penelope interviews him, he tells her a false story of his fate, so he keeps his disguise. He doesn't say who he really is. The story comes to its climax when Penelope finally proposes a contest for the suitors in which they are to string Odysseus' great bow and shoot an arrow through the shaft holes of 12 axes arranged in a row. She then proposes to marry the winner of this contest. Not surprisingly, none of the suitors can even string the bow, and in the end it is only Odysseus himself who is able to fulfill the task. It is only now that Odysseus reveals himself and, together with his son Telemachus and the help of Athena, kills all the suitors. But Penelope remains cautious, and before finally accepting that Odysseus has really returned, puts him to a last test when asking him about the special features of the bed in his own bedchamber. The issue here is the bed, Odysseus' bed, was built around an olive tree that grew inside the house, so the bed cannot be moved without chopping down the tree. And when Penelope actually says, "Oh, I've moved your bed in another chamber," he gets furious. He says, What happened to the olive tree?" So it's only after this that Penelope accepts that this must be the real Odysseus, because nobody else knows about the bed in the bedchamber. The story ends with another fighting scene in which the relatives of the killed suitors seek revenge, but this fight is ended by a peace imposed by Athena. Homer, however, told the story in a slightly different way. I've already said, as the contents of the story of Odysseus were already well known in Homer's time, the poet does not need to tell the events in the correct order. He only focused on the most decisive points of the story. Altogether, only a period of 40 actual days is covered in the story, starting from the point when Odysseus is finally allowed to leave the island of Calypso until his re-establishment as the king of Ithaca. Homer's Odyssey is subdivided into 24 chapters, or books as they are called here. Book 1 acts as a kind of prologue, in which by a council of the gods, Odysseus finally is allowed to return home from the island of Calypso. Books 2 to 4, instead of setting Odysseus on his way home, first tell the story of the journey which Odysseus' son Telemachus undertakes to find out news about his father. These books convey important information, as they explain to the reader the desolate situation in Odysseus' kingdom. Although Odysseus has been away for 20 years now, his wife, Penelope, still does believe that he will return one day. However, a group of suitors, young noblemen from Ithaca, urge her to forget Odysseus and marry one of them instead. This situation is bound to create tensions. Will Penelope remain loyal to Odysseus? How will the suitors react should Odysseus eventually return home? And what about Telemachus, his son? When Odysseus left for the Trojan War, Telemachus was just a baby. Now he's a young man of 20 years, so how will he react towards his father that he really doesn't know? It is only in Book 5 that we return to Odysseus and learn how he built a raft by which he leaves Calypso's island. On his way home to Ithaca, he is shipwrecked once more again due to Poseidon's wrath and barely manages to reach Scheria alive, the island of the Phaeacians. In books 6 to 12, Odysseus' stay on the island of Scheria is described, and in books 9 to 12, he actually tells the story of his wanderings and adventures to the Phaeacians. This order of the events is quite important here. When we first meet Odysseus on Calypso's island, he is a broken man, weeping out of desperation. He has lost all hope. But by retelling all his adventures to the Phaeacians, he regains his confidence and thus gains the strength to restore order to his own kingdom. From book 13 onwards, Homer's version follows the correct chronological order as detailed above. Without the microphone? Yes. Yeah, good. So this strange diagram up here is meant to illustrate this actually. So the arrow represents time, 20 years actually. On top of the arrow we have the correct chronological order, the 10 years of the Trojan War, the 10 years of Odysseus' wanderings in the Mediterranean. On the bottom of the arrow, the events as described in the Odyssey are illustrated. So the period that is really covered by the Odyssey only amounts for the last 40 days of the entire story. But, as mentioned before, in books 9 to 12, we have the so-called retrospective, where Odysseus tells his adventures from actually the conquest of Troy until his arrival to the island of the Phaeacians. This arrangement of the story reflects the succeeding stages of Odysseus' homecoming. In books 5 to 12, Odysseus' wanderings in the Mediterranean are described. Books 13 to 16 see Odysseus already on his own island, but still outside of the palace. In book 17, Odysseus finally reaches the palace, and the events unfolding there are described in books 17 to 22. And it is only in book 23, almost near the end of the story, that Odysseus reaches his own bedchamber, the innermost part of the palace. It should be noted that Odysseus' wanderings take place outside of the real world. What do I mean by this? It is only the starting point, Troy, and the end point, Ithaca, that can be securely placed on a map. All other locations of Odysseus' adventures have no secure position in the Mediterranean or elsewhere. And the various attempts by different scholars to identify the names of the places in the epic, such as the island of the Cyclops, the island of the nymph Calypso, the island of Scheria, and so on. So the attempts to identify these places with real places are no more than guesswork. In contrast, the false stories which Odysseus tells several times about his wanderings, all the places he names there, are all situated in the real world. the places he claims to have visited can be identified, such as the island of Crete, the region of Phoenicia, the country of Egypt, and so on. So this is something that you may want to discuss in class. Homer, I think, plays around with the concept of reality versus imagination. So Odysseus' real wanderings take part in an imagined world. Odysseus' lying stories take place in the real world. An interesting contrast. There are certainly many ways how to read the Odyssey. First of all, it is a fascinating adventure story, and without doubt was understood as such in ancient Greece. However, the story also conveys moral issues important for the ancient Greek society. Let us first take a look at Odysseus, the hero of the story. As in all such stories, the main characters always serve as role models for society in general. As should be clear by now, Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, is the hero of the story. He is characterized by a number of different attributes. First of all, he is a hero. He can and does fight if necessary. An example of his superior strength is given in the story of the bow contest. Book 21, line 409, where it is said, I quote, "So, without any strain, Odysseus strung the great bow," end of quote. Remember that all the suitors failed to fulfill this task. Odysseus is a pious man, always honoring the gods. Most important, however, is his intelligence, his resourcefulness. Remember, it was not the brutal strength of Achilles, another Greek hero, that led to the conquest of Troy, but Odysseus' plan of devising a stratagem, the wooden horse, that is mentioned in Book 8. So the story of the wooden horse is the following. The Greeks realized after several years that they could not breach the very strong walls of Troy, and so Odysseus proposed the following. They built a large wooden horse, hollow inside, in which a few of the Greek heroes would hide. The rest of the Greek army would withdraw. The Trojans, convinced that the Greeks had left, would bring the horse, which they thought was a kind of offering to the gods left by the Greeks, would bring the horse inside their city. And then, of course, they celebrated the victory at night when everybody was asleep. The heroes, hidden inside the horse, went out, opened the city gates, and the returning Greek army then was able to conquer Troy. Okay, it is not only a cleverness helping Odysseus to survive, such as in the case of the escape from the cave of the Cyclops, but a genuine curiosity. For instance, Odysseus enters the cave of the Cyclops out of pure curiosity. He does not really need to go there. This is described in Book 9, line 172 and following, where Odysseus addresses his men in the following way, I quote, "While I go and find out about these people and learn what they are, whether they are savage and violent and without justice, or hospitable to strangers and with minds that are godly." End of quote. Another example is Odysseus' way of interrogating the spirits of the dead in the underworld. Yes, on his travels, Odysseus even reaches the underworld, although he's not there yet. That is described in Book 11, line 228 and following, where Odysseus says, I quote, "I then thought about a way to question the spirits of the dead." End of quote. Again, he just does that to gain knowledge, to satisfy his curiosity, but not for any personal advantages. Odysseus is able to endure suffering to achieve his goals. It is basically the longing for his home and his family that let him endure all his misfortunes. So, most important is his determination. He uses all his resources to achieve one goal: come home to his wife and sons. Compared to the motivation of Gilgamesh, this seems a somewhat unheroic goal. Gilgamesh wanted fame, he wanted eternal life, and so on. Odysseus just wants to stay home with his wife and child. Okay. This certainly makes Odysseus a more sympathetic character, not only for modern eyes. Odysseus has been called the first modern man by the 20th century philosophers Adorno and Horkheimer. He's not only a hero with strength and courage, most famous he is for his resourcefulness, his ingenuity. And as I said, it is not only ingenuity born out of necessity to survive, but it is a genuine curiosity of all things surrounding him. It is the combination of his different attributes, his courage, his ability to endure suffering, but most important, his resourcefulness and curiosity, which truly make him one of the most fascinating Greek heroes. It is especially the latter attributes that actually paved the way to the so-called Greek Enlightenment during the 5th century BC, when philosophers and historians showed the same kind of curiosity. They want to investigate things around them. They want to know what is the truth, and so on. You will, in this course, you will read some of these historians, Thucydides, for instance, or some of the philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, and you will see what I mean by this. Further moral issues concern different points in the epic. Proper behavior, for instance. Homer is interestingly somewhat ambiguous when it comes to the question of fate versus free will. So fate means all things are determined for humans. Free will means they have a choice. Several passages indicate that the fate for humans was set by the gods. For instance, Book 1, lines 16 and 17, where it is said, I quote, "But when in the circling of the years that very year came, in which the gods had spun for him this time of homecoming," end of quote. It seems obvious from this quote that Odysseus was fated to wander around for 10 years after the Trojan War. He could do nothing to change it. On the other hand, the Odyssey contains passages that indicate that the gods often revised their decisions according to the behavior of the humans. So, humans are at least partly responsible for their fate. Recklessness and wrongdoing will lead to punishment by the gods, or in the case of the speakers, by Odysseus himself. To make that clear, that claim, let's look at another passage from Book 1, lines 6 to 9, where it is said, I quote, "Even so he could not save his companions, hard though he strove to, they were destroyed by their own wild recklessness, fools who devoured the oxen of Helios, the sun god, and he took away the day of their homecoming." End of quote. So here the key passage is, they were destroyed by their own wild recklessness. So it's the fault of the companions of Odysseus that they actually perished. Another passage is again in Book 1, lines 32 to 34, where Zeus the supreme god addresses the other gods in an assembly and says, I quote, "Oh, for shame, how the mortals put the blame upon us gods, for they say evil comes from us, but it is they, rather, who by their own recklessness win sorrow beyond what is given." End of quote. So here we hear from Zeus, the supreme god himself, who says, it is they, rather, who by their own recklessness win sorrow. Ideas about proper behavior are expressed on several different occasions in the Attic. A very important part is the proper treatment of foreigners and guests. Why? Why? Because these guests and foreigners bring news. We are in the days before radios, before television, before Twitter, and so on. So people get news by receiving strangers, foreigners, and so on as guests. And as a kind of payment for the hospitality, these foreigners have to tell the news they know. Compare, for instance, the proper behavior shown by King Nestor in Book 3, by Odysseus on Telemachus in Book 1, or by the Phaeacians towards Odysseus in Book 7, who all receive the guests in a proper way, feed them, provide them with a place to sleep, and so on, with the improper behavior of the Cyclops, told in Book 9, where the Cyclops, instead of receiving Odysseus and his companions as guests, starts to kill them and eat them. Of course, also the guests themselves have obligations, not only telling their hosts all they know, the news and so on, but also to behave properly. The suitors in Odysseus' palace clearly misbehave. They outstay their welcome, they insult Penelope, Odysseus' wife, and other guests, such as Odysseus himself, even if he's disguised as a beggar, but still, that's something you don't do. So all these events are described in Book 17. What, according to the Odyssey, makes human life valuable? Fame is an important component for any man in a heroic society to establish his position in society. The Odyssey, however, is remarkable for putting less stress on fame gained by heroic deeds or in battle. See, for instance, the speech of Achilles in the underworld. I already mentioned Achilles. He was one of the heroes in the Trojan War, but he was killed in battle before the conquest of Troy. And now, when Odysseus visits the underworld, he actually meets the spirit, or the soul, however you want to call it, of the dead Achilles. That's described in Book 11, line 488 and following. And Achilles addresses Odysseus in the following way, I quote, "O shining Odysseus, never console me for dying. I would rather follow the plough as a thrall," meaning a slave, "to another man, one with no land allotted him and not much to live on, than be a king over all the perished dead." End of quote. So the background of the story is, as a very young man, Achilles was confronted with a choice. The gods told him he can either have a short but very glorious life, becoming a famous warrior, or a long but boring and uneventful life. So Achilles chose the first option, but now, after he's dead, he clearly regrets this decision. So more stress is actually put on fame, won at home by leading a proper life with family and friends. That is illustrated by a passage from Book 19, line 332 and following, where it is said, I quote, "But when man is blameless himself, and his thoughts are blameless, the friends he has entertained carry his fame widely." End of quote. These certainly can be seen as unheroic elements of society. Contrast this attitude, for instance, with the one propagated by the Epic of Gilgamesh, who wants fame beyond anything else. However, it has to be emphasized that Odysseus is not portrayed as a peaceful man or even a coward. He can and does fight, if necessary, but he's not only praised for his strength and his fighting qualities, but rather for his intelligence and resourcefulness. In addition, reputation rests on being a just man. See, for instance, Book 4, line 689 and following, where it is said, I quote, "What kind of man Odysseus was among your own parents, how he did no act and spoke no word in his own country that was unfair. And that is a way divine kings have. One will be hateful to a certain man and favor another, but Odysseus was never outrageous to any man." When asked who he is, Odysseus several times embarks on a false story. For instance, in books 13, 14, and 19, where he tells different people not his own name, not his real name, and not what he has really seen, but he invents stories. This, of course, he does not do for simple cheating, but to protect himself until he finds out more about the situation in his country. Remember, he had been away for 20 years, and certainly it may be dangerous for him if he just walks into the doors of his palace and says, "Hi, honey, I'm back." He knows that several of the other Greek heroes from the Trojan War, upon their return, were murdered by faithless wives, by other people who wanted or became kings during their leave, and so on and so forth. So Odysseus is cautious, and that's why he does not reveal himself. It has been noted above that his false stories actually sound more credible than his real wanderings, as in the false stories no gods and monsters appear, and the places he names actually can all be located. It is also important to note that once Odysseus revealed himself, he does not tell false stories anymore. That is from book 22 onwards. The more general attitude towards the truth in this epic is the concept that truth is often hidden. Also, the gods often appear in disguise in the story, and Odysseus himself disguises as a beggar. The moral of the epic in this case certainly is that one should not accept things as they appear to be on first sight, but to seek for a hidden truth. Lying is not condemned in the epic as long as it serves a certain purpose. See, for instance, Athena's speech towards Odysseus in book 13, line 291 and following, where Athena, in disguise, asks Odysseus who he is, and Odysseus tells one of his stories again. Athena, as the goddess, of course, knows exactly who's in front of her, and so she answers Odysseus, I quote, "You wretch, so devious, never wary of tricks, then you would not even in your own country give over your ways of deceiving and your thievish tales. They are near to you in your very nature." That sounds a bit like criticism, right? But she continues, "But come, let us talk no more of this, for you and I both know short practice, since you are far the best of all mortal men for counsel and stories, and I among all the divinities am famous for wit and sharpness. End of quote. So the interesting thing is, here Athena, a goddess, compares herself to Odysseus, a mortal man, and she praises the same qualities here. So what about the relations between man and gods in this story? The ancient Greeks believed in many gods. Besides the 12 main so-called Olympian gods, there was a multitude of minor gods which sometimes appear in the story, such as the nymph Calypso. This situation is bound to create problems, as the gods do not always agree with each other. In the Trojan War, they even openly fight with each other, as some gods support the Trojan side, whereas others favor the Greeks. The gods in the Odyssey are all described with human characteristics. They quarrel, they're greedy, and sometimes even unjust. Poseidon's hatred towards Odysseus clearly is a case of unjust behavior. Poseidon's wrath is purely based on personal motives, as Odysseus blinded his son, the Cyclops. It is not a case of punishing Odysseus for unjust or immoral behavior. Thus, not all the gods are portrayed as higher moral authorities in the epic. Quite interesting. Only Zeus clearly stands out as representing the principle of justice. So the only aspects that distinguish all the gods from humans are their superhuman powers, and of course the fact that gods are immortal. The gods do not only watch humans from far away, but actively engage themselves in human affairs, sometimes in a negative way, for instance, Poseidon shattering Odysseus' raft in Book 5, or in a positive way, Athena advising and protecting Odysseus, even making plans together with him in Book 13. The gods are portrayed as part of the human life, and they are portrayed by humans according to their own image. Nevertheless, it is made explicitly clear that the gods need to be honored. Odysseus is described as a pious man by Zeus himself. This is borne out in Book 1, line 65 and following, where Zeus says about Odysseus, I quote, "How could I forget Odysseus, the godlike, he who is beyond all other men in mind, and who beyond others has given sacrifice to the gods who hold wide heaven." End of quote. Finally, the story of the Cyclops, told in Book 9, which is certainly one of the key events in the first 12 books, will be discussed here in detail to illuminate some of the key concepts of the Odyssey. When looking at the description of the way of life of the Cyclopes, we obtain a clear idea of the Greek concept of civilization versus barbarity. The Cyclopes lack all the essential features the Greeks associated with civilization. They are described as having no agriculture, as living in caves instead of proper houses, they have no laws, they have no council meeting, they're not fearing the gods, and they do not respect the law of hospitality. So this negative list of issues shows what the Greeks associated with a civilized life, exactly the opposite. Furthermore, this story brings out the main characteristics of Odysseus. It is first of all Odysseus' curiosity which brings him and his companions into a terribly dangerous situation by being locked up in the cave of the Cyclops, with the Cyclops starting to kill Odysseus' men one by one. On the other hand, through his cleverness and courage, Odysseus manages to rescue them again. Lastly, this story clearly illustrates the concept of being a hero. When first asked for his name by the Cyclops, Odysseus answered that it was nobody. This somewhat enigmatic response is explained only when, after being blinded, the Cyclops by Odysseus, the Cyclops calls for help from his fellow Cyclopes. When they rush to our Cyclops cave and ask what's the matter, our Cyclops responds, oh, nobody has blinded me. And then the other Cyclopes reassuredly return to their own caves, thinks maybe it was just a nightmare or something. While this clever trick saved Odysseus and his companions from facing the other side, having to face the other Cyclopes, it unfortunately is at odds with the concept of heroism. A hero needs his proper name to be associated with his deeds. He needs the fame. It is not good enough if people tell, oh, somebody, but I don't know who, forgot the name, did this and this. No. A person only can have fame if his name is known, if his name is associated with specific deeds. It is for this reason, not just for pure recklessness, that Odysseus, once he has escaped from the cave, announces his proper name to the Cyclops. The tragic irony of this act is that the Cyclops now has the personal details of his adversary, and he asks his father Poseidon to punish Odysseus. As we learn from the story, Odysseus will have to pay a heavy price for this, and he will have to use all his courage and his intelligence to escape Poseidon's wrath. But that is something that will be, told in next week's lecture. That's it. Thank you.